And we're back. So, excuse me. So we get to a point where national government power goes through a growth, but there's going to be a point where we're going to see a stagnation in that national government power, and a lot of that's going to be signified by here in Barron versus Baltimore. The question is whether the due process clause of the Fifth Amendment apply to the state. So we haven't gotten to all the amendments yet, but we have it where through the Fifth Amendment, there's called just compensation. The property of the United States of America belongs to the United States of America, and so if you live within any country, really in the civilized world, you might be able to buy property. But if there is determined to be a need, government can take the property from you, and in the United States, you have to be compensated for that taking. This does not mean you're going to get the money that you think the property is worth. You're going to get the money that the government think the property is worth. So keep that in mind. So just because somebody takes your property, that doesn't mean that you can, for something that's worth $50,000, you can get $50 million for. That's not how it works. Excuse me. And so Barron owns a wharf. Barron owns a wharf, and what happens is the city of Baltimore is taking marshland and kind of filling it in with dirt from other parts of the city and other parts of the state. And so they go in, and what they're doing is they're making land. And actually, they did this in Boston. They've done this many places on the coast where they took unstable land and they filled it in and made it more stable. And so they're filling in the land, and they have all this extra construction dirt. And they decide to just get rid of the rest of the dirt that they don't need. And so they said, hey, there's a waterway over here. If we dump it in the waterway, the dirt's just going to sink to the bottom. No harm, no foul. But that's not actually how it works. If you take water that comes from like a pond or a wet area and throw it into a pond, because there's moisture in that dirt, it's going to sink to the bottom. There'll be a little bit of silt and dirt left that'll dissipate across the pond, but it doesn't really damage the water. But if you take dirt that's not from a wet area and doesn't have moisture already built into it, it will, once it hits the water, start to mix and start to become muddy because the dirt's absorbing the moisture and it's mixing with the water rather than just sinking to the bottom, and it's going to damage the use of that waterway, especially if a wharf. Because if you have a boat and you want to park your boat somewhere, you don't want to park it in a dirty wharf, because you're going to spend all your time cleaning your boat. You're never going to get a chance to use it. It's going to damage the engine. It's going to damage some other areas that the boat needs. It's going to make the boat not look so nice. And so nobody wants to park their boat in Barron's Wharf. Nobody. And so he argues that this is a damaging or a taking of his property, which it is. And he says, and he goes to the Supreme Court and he says, Supreme Court, if this was the federal government, I would have to be compensated for the damage to my property or the loss of use of my property. And the Supreme Court says, we agree. And Barron says, I want you to apply this to the state as well, so the state has to compensate me. And the Supreme Court at this time says, well, we can't. Because at this time in 1833, and this will come into actual existence 20 years later, but at this time in 1833, the Bill of Rights does not apply to the states. So, and because the Bill of Rights doesn't apply to the states, he cannot be compensated, and the states can take his property and damage the property as well. Again, in the beginning, the Bill of Rights only applies to the national government. And so at this time, unfortunately, Barron cannot, claim any damage that is caused by by the state, because the Bill of Rights does not apply to the states at this time. But we're gonna see something. This is that stagnation I was discussing. Instead of the national government and the Supreme Court saying, hey, well, we're going to apply the Bill of Rights to the states as well and expanding national government power, the national government does not do that. And in such, kind of lays out an understanding that, we're not taking any more power. And so now we're going to see the national government power plateau in the 1830s. And our understanding of our federal system is going to change. So before we move into the before we move into dual federalism, prior to dual federalism, this is what we had. We had a system where national government was supreme to states, and state creates local government. That's called traditional federalism or layer cake federalism. Before we even had this, and I didn't draw this, we had the Confederation. I call that our political science has named a lot of the federalisms, and so you have layer cake federalism, which is traditional federalism. You have marble cake federalism, which is cooperative federalism. And so I've actually given names to the Confederation. The Confederation is upside down pineapple cake federalism. And then I gave dual federalism a dessert because there's no cake that I could think of, but I called it side-by-side federalism. There's a company called Steak and Shake that makes or used to make a side-by-side milkshake where they would pour the two types of milkshake into your glass, and they would kind of make a perfect divide down the middle, and one flavor would be on the right side and one flavor would be on the left. And so those are the types of federalism. So we have traditional federalism, which is layer cake. Every layer handles its own responsibility. National handled national, state handles state, local handles local. There's no intermingling of the three. They handle their own levels of government only. But we're about to make a transition where our Supreme Court, because people don't live forever, is going to get some new faces. And those new faces don't necessarily interpret the Supreme Court the same way that they had previously interpreted the Constitution. So they're going to interpret differently than they previously did, and they're going to interpret it this way. Again, I'm going to call it side-by-side federalism or side-by-side milkshake federalism. Now, again, I know you see my picture. I am not an artist. I am a drawer. So, again, I drew this the best I could. So, national government is going to have the enumerated powers only, or those stated powers only. Whatever is actually written down in the Constitution, which is your powers under the enumerated powers and your powers under the concurrent powers. That's what's written down. And because of the 10th Amendment, the states have everything else. So everything else. So the two levels of government are equal under this understanding, where national has what it's given to it and written down, and states have what is given to it written down. So again, the Taney Court, this is that new court, that change in the Supreme Court, again, looks at the Constitution differently, saying, again, national government, you have your enumerated and concurrent powers. Those are written down in the Constitution. That's what you have. States, you have everything else under the 10th Amendment. And that's the way that government starts to act at this point, where because the Supreme Court's different and interprets the Constitution different, it's going to be different. So Dred Scott versus Sanford is an 1857 case, which discusses the ownership of slaves, the status of the fugitive slaves, and slavery in the new territories. Dred Scott, he was a slave born around 1795. We don't really know when Dred Scott was born because not every slave owner did a great accounting of when slaves were born or died. It's very interesting. He's unable to take action of buying his own freedom. So what happens is this. During this time, the territory of Missouri is not yet a state, but they've decided that they're going to they're a free territory, but they're going to honor the rights of other states. And so Dred Scott and his master go into Missouri, which is a free territory, but he's still a slave because Missouri is going to honor the slave-like relationship that he has from his home. But while in Missouri, Dred Scott's master passes away. And so this goes into this huge argument about whether Dred Scott is free because he's in a free territory, or if he's a slave because under normal understanding of inheritance, the heirs of a property would inherit the property of the deceased individual. And so There's a part of the abolitionists that argue that Dred Scott's free because, again, he's in a free territory, so he's no longer a slave. And then there's the individuals saying, well, no, Dred Scott is like a chair, and like a chair that, if somebody dies and they leave behind a chair, that chair would be passed on to their descendants. And so those are the two areas where we're flowing on. And there's two very highly contentious groups arguing over this on Dred Scott's behalf, because since Dred Scott's a slave, he actually can't bring this case on his own behalf, which normally you would have to do as a citizen. You would have to have standing, meaning you would have to have the action would have to actually connect to you in order for it to be of issue. So again, Abbas argued that since Dred Scott had lived and stayed in a free territory that he was free. I guess states' rights individuals would argue that Dred Scott was a slave. I guess state rights individuals at this time would argue that Dred Scott's a slave and he should be returned to his master. Well, the Supreme Court rules that Dred Scott was not a citizen and was never thought of or spoken of except for as property. And so because he is property, he has to be returned to the descendants of his master, which means that he had to be returned into slavery. And this is very interesting because this is a win for states, because the territory of Missouri was saying, hey, we honor the slave relationship. Even though we're a free territory, he should be returned. And so the states are going to the states are talking about this argument. The states are, looking at it, the territory of Missouri is looking at it this way. And the states see that a territory is able to stand up to the national government, and rule in that favor and rule in the territory's favor. If a territory can stand up to national government, surely states, which are stronger than a territory, have the ability to stand up to the national government. And so this is going to be the catalyst for the states, standing up and saying, you know what, we want our rights back. We want to be something other than what the states say we are, and we want our ability to do in our territories as we see fit. And we see that with Missouri, so surely we as states also have a superior power to do so. And that's what's going to actually lead into some of the ideas of the Civil War. Now, Dred Scott's not the catalyst for the Civil War, but it's going to end up to be some of the ideas that are born out of this. They're going to be some of the ideas that are going to turn into some of the foundations that we see for the Civil War. So there's what is called nullification, the right of the state to void a federal law. There's ideas that, that if you don't agree with a law that is put into play because you believe it is wrong, you should pretend like it doesn't exist. That's nullification. And although it sounds that very appealing, the law is the law, and the best way to fight a law is to bring it up in the forum that we have and fight it through the court system to affect our Constitution the most beneficial way to affect our Constitution. And there are some laws that were terrible. The Alien Sedition Act during the Civil War was a law that was wrong. It was telling people that they didn't have the First Amendment ability to speak up against their government, and many people, pretended like that law didn't exist. Nullification was used in that manner, and yeah, it was wrong, and history has proven that it is wrong. However, nullification might not have been nullification, and the use of nullification is going to end up being one of the main arguments that are used by the Confederate States of America in their separation from the United States. So what we have is the Confederate States come up with a theory. They say the federal government was but an agent of the state, and the people and the individual state governments that fall under that subdivision. So what they're saying is, at the top, and this is actually really how the organization of government works. At the top is the people, and then they put it together governments, and governments are servants of the people. Well, that is indeed true, but they're saying that it's not just the people that are at the top. The people and the states are at the top, and the people and the states dictate what the national government does. And so instead of saying people, then the national government, then the states, then the local government, they're saying people in the states, then the national government falls under the people in the states. And the Constitution was just a mere agreement, not the standard of what government is, but they're saying they're trying to downgrade the Constitution from the document that lays out the legal structure of government, down to just a mere agreement, just some guidelines. And they said the Supreme Court could not judge Congress and was answerable to the states, that the people of the states could hold conventions to nullify Congress, and any law would need 3/4 ratification, which is the standard we actually need to amend the Constitution. So they're saying not just law, not just amendments need 3/4 ratification, but even laws need 3/4 ratification. And if unhappy, states could secede from the Union. So the states are unable to put these practices into place, and since they're unhappy, they do what we know that they did. They secede from the Union to create the Confederate States of America. Now, we know what happens. The North wins and the South loses, and with the death of the Confederacy, we also see the death of dual federalism. And so now we are back to traditional federalism, but we would probably would argue that this is traditional federalism 2.0, because it's a much stronger national government, and the national government is now going to take some of the responsibilities that belong to the states. The Civil War forever changed the nature of federalism and dual federalism's emphasis on independent strength of states. Railroad construction, which used to be belong to the states, no longer now belong to the federal government. Banking belong to the federal government for the most part. There's now one currency. The Confederate currency goes away, and now we have federal currency. Canal building, so the ability to regulate, rivers and passages are now federal control of the federal government. In Tennessee, they had the Tennessee, or still have the Tennessee Valley Authority, where the federal government came into farmers who lived in low-lying areas and bought up the land, created dams at the end of high rivers in high areas, and dams at the bottom of rivers at low areas, and dammed up the water between those areas and made giant lakes. And as the water passes through the dam at the top and the water passes through the dam at the bottom, it creates hydroelectric power, which at one point powered the Southeast, and now pretty much just powers Tennessee and that area in the Tennessee Valley. And so this gave electricity to a lot of areas that didn't have electricity. But that's a huge federal government program that came into play. And so, but that wouldn't be done without the federal government having power over the lands and the rivers and other things that traditionally belong to the states. And then again, ports belong to the federal government. Things that are going in and out of the country by sea are now controlled by the federal government and no longer controlled by the states as well. So the Supreme Court once again changed its direction of rulings, started ruling in favor of the national government. The Taney Court is gone. People are passing away, and the president is able to put other people on the court. So again, the Supreme Court starts ruling in favor of the national government in many areas as well. Now, there are some areas that we don't see the Supreme Court rule in. We see we have the Sherman Antitrust Act, which kind of stops some monopolies of our strong businesses in the United States, which are kind of dictating the wealth of the everyday person. And so we're going to see that the federal government doesn't regulate every single area of manufacturing, but many of those areas do become regulated. Businesses become highly regulated by the federal government. One of the ways, there's actually two things that are going to increase national government power during this era: the 16th and the 17th Amendment. Prior to this moment in time, our national government still does not have an income tax. So the federal income tax that you pay, or I pay, doesn't exist at this point. And so to create one, Congress first tries to create the Federal Income Tax Act, which is a law that gives the federal government ability to tax the people. But it's unconstitutional because you can't create an income tax by law. It had to be amended in the Constitution because you're giving Congress an additional power that's not written down to it in the Constitution. And so the law gets deemed to be unconstitutional, and then the federal government tries to pass an act, and it passes an amendment, and it passes, which creates the 16th Amendment, which allows the federal government now to tax its citizenry across the whole nation. And the citizenry gives up money to the national government. And there's a movie that I like called Scarface. And in there he has a quote. It says first you get the money, then you get the power. And there's actually a continuation on the quote, but we'll just stop at that point. But first you get the money, then you get the power. And because now the federal government has more money, they indeed have more power. They have all this extra money that they've never had before, and they're able to use it in many different ways and different programs and other things that elevate the amount of power that the national government has. They also create the 17th Amendment, which is going to remove some power from the states. Prior to this moment in time, our state legislatures, are representatives of a state, not on the national level, but on the state level. So your state house of representatives would choose who your state senators would be. So who paid? The states paid them, and they were chosen by the states. So who are they going to listen to? Well, the states. And now, since the federal government is going to allow the citizenry to choose through the 17th Amendment, these individuals, and we have all this extra tax money to pay them, now those individuals are not beholden or not, they don't have to directly listen to state legislators. They listen to the people of the states, or they have conversations as legislators, and they listen to the individuals in the federal government. So this changes our dynamic and our understanding of where power resides in the national government. Individuals of the national government are no longer as tied to the states as they used to be, except through their election. So all of these changes happen, but eventually there's going to be a problem. We're going to go through an era where national government has this power, and there's going to be some stagnation on the change in that power, which is, I don't mean stagnation is a bad, but we're just not going to see much power change. But the world is going to end up in what is called the Great Depression. In 1920, the banks failed. In 1921, a slump in agriculture. In 1926, construction was in decline. In 1929, inventories were at an all-time high. That means nobody's buying anything. And October 29th, 1929, the stock market crashes, which is a very sad predicament. And it leads into the Great Depression. And it's very interesting because, the federal government has now gained all this money and gained all this ability. But it's very interesting because the federal government doesn't really step in to address this right away. They go to the states and say, states, you've been willing to you wanted all this responsibility, you wanted all these things to do. Well, here's your chance. Fix it. And unfortunately, because the national government has taken money and power from the states are fairly unable to fix the problem. And so the problem persists until the early 1930s. And in 1930, we have a change in president with a different view on how the national government should handle such things. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt is elected in 1932 and comes into office in 1933. And he runs on this program of relief, recovery, and reform, which we know today is the New Deal. National government intervention to stabilize the economy and reduce the suffering of Americans. That's what the point of it was. And so there's going to be a couple things. There's going to be the creation of the Federal Housing Administration, which is going to allow for financing of homes. Where you have the Citizen Construction Corps, which is going to build things such as the Hoover Dam and many of the tunnels that you see going through the mountains in the West. So you can take individuals and say, hey, you're going to come out here and work for the government, and you're going to be able to send money home to your families to support your families, but we're going to put you to work where many people are out of work. The Agricultural Adjustment Administration, which is going to help stabilize the cost of food, and the National Recovery Administration, again, aided the AAA, where they go out to farms and ask farmers not to grow on a certain percentage of their land, but still get paid for that land. So we could stabilize how much food was on the shelves during that time. And that's actually still done today. We pay many farmers not to grow because we don't want too much food on the shelves. And then as a response to them not making enough money, then we're going to have too little food on the shelves. It helps stabilize the amount of food that's needed to keep costs at a certain area, and also to keep farmers farming. this is going to change how we look at government and how government exists. No longer are we a traditional federalism where we have these defined layers of government. We now still have the levels where national is supreme to state and state creates local, but we're now a cooperative federalism where the levels of government are intertwined. National may do a local responsibility. National and state may work together. National might just, work with local on certain abilities. So let's do a couple examples of these. National reaching down and doing a local responsibility. This one right here. Many people went to Head Start. Head Start is a national program that aids children whose parents can't afford for them to go to preschool to get early education to be ready for kindergarten, the first years of school. It's a good program that gives everybody the ability to have the foundation that they need to go into education. It's a great program. So, but that's a local area idea, but it's done by the national government. National government may work with the states to create a program or to do something, such as our interstate. Our interstates were created by the federal government, but now maintained by the states. So you can definitely tell when you go from state to state, the roadways are different. So the federal government still gives money to the states, but the states are pretty much responsible for the maintaining of those roads. And so the national government put them together, but the states are up to their maintaining and their growth and what they need to be done with them. But that's a national program that's done on the state level. And then states and locals. Many of you have used the public library. Hopefully you still use public libraries. We still need them. Many of them probably aren't as big or have as many books as they used to since with the advent of computers. But a lot of our small localities or rural areas especially did not have public libraries. Books today are still very expensive. And so what is done is many state or national governments have given money to our local governments to have libraries so people can be educated, and it helps a community where more people have the ability to read or use materials or enhance their knowledge. It benefits the area. And so states have given money to local localities to build libraries so they can enhance the education of the citizenry. That's important. But this is an example of how marble cake federalism works, or cooperative federalism. So again, we had Confederation, which was upside down pineapple federalism. Then we had traditional federalism, which is layer cake federalism. We had dual federalism, which was the side-by-side milkshake. And now we have cooperative federalism, which is marble cake federalism. So, the Supreme Court's opposition to the New Deal. Not all of the New Deal comes in and goes in the way just very smoothly. There's a huge fight over how government was operating and how government is going to operate. And so, the Supreme Court is, when the New Deal starts to get put into play, the Supreme Court starts ruling against many of the programs that are going to be done in the New Deal. And because of that, we have a very interesting relationship between President Franklin Delano Roosevelt and some entities within government and some entities within society, because many people in society say this goes against our laissez-faire capitalist system. So if things are supposed to dismantle and die, they should be dismantling and dying. And FDR really didn't see that way. And so what he does is something that probably will never be done again. A huge threat to change the composition of the Supreme Court. Now, we've had that hinted at in recent years, but an actual credible, I'm going to change the construction of our Supreme Court probably won't ever be done again, because our Supreme Court has had 9 justices for over 100 years now. And so with America, it's kind of weird. With certain things that exist for 100 years, we act like they've been there since the beginning, which they haven't. The Supreme Court has been 9, for a while. but it's solidified itself at 9. I don't ever think somebody's going to add any justices to the court and change its composition. But Franklin Delano Roosevelt threatens to change the composition of the court to help him pass his programs, and the court switches its ruling and ends up ruling in favor of his programs. Now, this is actually pretty brilliant by the Supreme Court, because they did acquiesce or give in to his threat, but they saved the court's autonomy as a branch of government, which is important, because we don't want somebody just changing the court's composition whenever they see fit. And that would have laid out a precedent for a president, or it would have laid out an example for a president to do that when they wanted to benefit themselves. And so this ended up keeping the Supreme Court at its composition of 9, just by giving in a little bit to FDR's belief that his program is beneficial. And this is known as the switch in time to save 9. So I don't ever think our Constitution will change. I mean, our Supreme Court will change its composition to more than 9. Again, we've seen some threats in that in modern times, but this was the most credible one. But again, our judiciary has saved itself many times from being changed from the other branches of government. Again, today, we have a marble cake federalism, where the levels of government are intertwined, much like a marble cake. There's no straight lines of how they work and interact. Things are mixed and intertwined between the levels of government, and that's how we operate today. So that's the end of Chapter 3. I hope everybody's doing well in their course so far. If you have any questions, make sure you're emailing me or calling me or trying to get a hold of me if you have questions, and I hope to see you soon. Thank you.